Hello, everybody. This is your Canadian friend, Reed Dudar. Your Jewish friend, your hockey fan, who... Bad start. Anyway, gotta go with it. It's almost 1 year anniversary of this YouTube channel. I don't edit stuff. This is ground control, early YouTube beginnings. Anyway, rambling, I don't care. The new trailer for Captain America Civil War, the final trailer, or trailer 2, debuted today. And that has got my comic book nerd juices flowing. Or as John Schnepp would say, I got all sweaty. This video is just a little introduction. I don't know why I'm... Gotta go with it. I don't care. That's how it is. That's how we roll in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Why I collect comics? Why I started collecting comics? I'm been alive for a while, and I started collecting comics as a young kid in the mid '80s. I think it was 1984, maybe early 1985, from what I remember. And I lived in the west end of Edmonton, Alberta, in the Lessard area, Collingwood area, West Edmonton Village, when it was just getting built, area of the city. For those people in Edmonton, anyone else who watches this video won't have a clue what I'm talking about, and that's okay. And I would always go with my mom to the corner store. There was a place called Lessard Mall, and it had a Max, or it had a Red Rooster back then, and it had this little drugstore, pharmacy. And inside this pharmacy was a comic book rack, old school comic book rack, where, what was it? 6 feet tall, 5 feet tall, spun around. Hopefully we know what a comic book rack is. And that's where comics were. And that was the first time I ever saw comics. And one time, my mom was awesome, and she let me pick out a whole bunch of comics. So, I'm a huge superhero fan, superhero mark, comic book movie guy, excuse me. I have been for years. And even as you get older, comics every now and then have brought me back, where I've tried to collect them, back and then. Like when I first collected comics, when I started at that little pharmacy, I collected comics from that point on till about 1992. So I had a good 7-8 year run of collecting comics, where I built up a collection of over 2,000 comics that are still somehow secured in some storage locker run by a family member, that are still hanging in there. Boxes, plastic covered. And comics, I just fell in love with comics. Like, I knew, who certain superheroes were, thanks to television, thanks to, Superman movies and stuff like that. Sesame Street and the Electric Company always had Spider-Man, had a Spider-Man show section. I don't know how to put it. That sounds stupid, I don't care. But comics, reading those comics introduced me to a lot of things. Now, I'm not saying lots of people lie, but I'm honest, and the first comics I bought in my life weren't the big ones everyone says. The first Marvel comics I ever bought were Daredevil, Power Man and Iron Fist, and Web of Spider-Man. Yeah. Not Spectacular Spider-Man, not The Amazing Spider-Man, Web of Spider-Man. Those were the first 3 Marvel comics I ever collected. And then I collected Iron Man, back when, in the comics, Tony Stark was a drunk fuck, and James Rhodes, who everyone knows as War Machine, pretended to be Iron Man for like 2 years in the comic book universe, and no one knew he was pretending to be Tony Stark, because no one ever saw him out of the suit. But James Rhodes was black, and he was this black character pretending to be Iron Man, and he went on adventures, and he went to some Avengers meetings, and he became a member of the West Coast Avengers, another comic I really liked when I was a kid. I'm bringing up the black thing, African American thing for a reason. And then on the DC side of things, the first comics I collected or ever bought were Green Lantern, when John Stewart was the main Green Lantern at that time. Hal Jordan was in Green Lantern. He was like on vacation or retired or whatever. But John Stewart was the main Green Lantern, which I thought was weird because I'm like, I didn't know John Stewart, Green Lantern, was black. But I didn't care. I knew who Green Lantern was and I wanted to read the comic. I collected, so Green Lantern, Firestorm, yeah, and I want to say, I'm pretty sure it was Batman, but it could have been Detective Comics, but it was a Batman comic. I think it was just Batman. And those were the first comics I ever bought from this little corner store, pharmacy, in Lassard Mall. And, you know, every couple of weeks we'd go there, and you're a kid, you don't know. You just go there and you look at comics, and, oh, I'm going to buy. So eventually I bought more comics and got into it. Now, I lived in an apartment building complex at the time, and there was this man, an older man at the time, named John, who turned out to be, he was gay. And in the mid-'80s, that was a big deal. To some, it's still a big deal. But when you're a little kid in a neighborhood and there's lots of families and kids, having an older man who many suspected was gay at that time was a little controversial for whatever reason. He lived by himself. He might have been 20. It's weird. It sounds weird when I'm telling it. But trust me when I say he was one of the best people I ever knew. And thanks to him, I truly got into my love for comics. And at the time, I remember, you know, because, you know, apartment complexes and houses and neighborhoods, everyone kind of hung out together, and there are different age groups, you know. My first kiss was with a woman who was 5 years older than me. Like, it was just, you know, that's just how we grew up then. So there wasn't a lot of age discrimination. There was respect for older people. Older kids got along with younger kids. We all played street hockey together, grass hockey, road hockey. We played guns. We would run around the complex and shoot each other with toy guns. We would act out superhero stuff or movies, play in the sandbox, build forts, go on adventures, look, you know, stuff. So this John man sometimes would hang out with us, and there was nothing weird or creepy about it at all. He didn't have a lot of friends. A lot of the kids liked him. I mean, you know, he hung out with us. Anyway, he got me into comics, and he brought me to my first ever comic book store. Old school Edmonton reference. It was in Stony Plain Road in Edmonton, Alberta. It was called Tumbleweed Books. And when John took me to this comic book store, which I didn't even know was a thing. I'm still a little, like, what am I, 12 years old, 11, 10? I don't know how old I was, 12, maybe. And maybe he was 18 or 19. But anyway, there was an age gap. He was an adult. He had his own apartment. He had a job. I was a kid going to elementary school or junior high and, you know, whatever. But he brought me to my first ever comic book store, and it blew my mind. And they had comics in that comic book store I'd never heard of. And then I understood this whole concept that comics came there first, and then eventually comics would trickle down into 7-Eleven, Red Rooster, Max, convenience stores, that kind of thing. So, you know, my world opened up. I found out about the new Teen Titans, the Legion of Superheroes, Superman comics, the Avengers, the West Coast Avengers, Captain America. So my love for comics started in the early 80s, and I eventually got a file at that comic book store and bought comics there for a good number of years. The location moved across the street a couple years later, and eventually my mom would, you know, as Christmas gifts, she would go to the comic book store and buy my file of comics and wrap them all up for me at Christmas gifts, and I would have like 80 comics under the Christmas tree because, you know, I didn't have money to buy all of them, or I'd let my file build up and the collection would get big. And when I started collecting comics, you know, late 84, and then 85 and going on to 86, 87. That was prime time because in DC, Crisis on Infinite Earths came out, which shocked the DC universe back time at that time. And Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns came out. And then Frank Miller did this very awesome Daredevil story that blew my mind as a kid called Born Again, which a lot of people know, where Kingpin destroyed Matt Murdock's life, found out his secret identity, which was super crazy back in the mid 80s. And then I got into the Uncanny X-Men and the Legion of Superheroes and a whole bunch. My world just, and I eventually ended up collecting all these comics. So I've loved comics since then, and in 92, 93, I had to stop collecting comics because they were getting a little bit too expensive and just life things. And then, I didn't really buy comics for 10 years. I got into comics again around 2003, 2004, when Jim Lee did a 1-year run on Superman, which I read in Wizard magazine, and I was like, holy fuck, I like Jim Lee. I remember when he did artwork for the X-Men in the early 90s, whatever. So I bought that, and I bought a couple other comics, and then famed Marvel artist John Byrne, who I knew from Fantastic Four when I started collecting comics. Eventually he went to DC and he did this series called Legends, which had a Dark Side Apocalypse connection, and then he redid Superman with the Man of Steel miniseries and a whole bunch of stuff. And John Byrne did all this work for DC, which I loved because I knew him from Marvel, but DC was my favorite. So I collected comics in a very ripe time for me. New Teen Titans was starting. DC was starting this thing called Baxter series, where it was a higher quality paper, a little bit better artwork, a little bit more expensive. And they did that with New Teen Titans, Infinity Incorporated, The Outsiders, Legion of Superheroes. I remember buying those and loving them. And then Marvel, Fantastic Four got my attention. And anyway, this video was just to explain how I fell into my love of comics. And even though, in the 2000s, like 2006, Civil War brought me back into comics, and I bought that, and I bought Frank Miller and Jim Lee did this series called All-Star Batman and Robin, which was awesome, which sadly ended way too soon. And I collected all these other comics, and then that was the time of DC doing Final Crisis, Identity Crisis, and then Marvel did a good run where they did Civil War, Dark Avengers, Secret Invasion, World War Hulk, the Illuminati in that time period. And then, now, like, it's 2016, and I don't collect comics anymore. I'll buy trade paperbacks. I buy them when I can for The Walking Dead and event stuff. I just can't, I'm OCD as it is. I'm a huge movie fan. I collect movies. I collect Blu-rays, and other things. So I just don't have the time to be a comic book guy. But I've been a fan of comics off and on since late 84, early 85. And comics taught me, why I brought up the black thing earlier, is just I never saw race as an issue. I still don't. My first Green Lantern was John Stewart. My first Iron Man was James Rhodes. So that taught me, reading comics, to accept everyone at face value, skin color, different races, different creeds. Seeing different superheroes in those comics taught me to treat human beings as human beings. And having a gay man be my conduit into collecting comics taught me a high level of respect and tolerance for people who are gay, who choose to be gay, who are born that way, whatever it is. So I wasn't born, I didn't have a lot of hatred or anything that a lot of people maybe grow up now. It's a different time, social media, yada yada yada. But I just wanted to say that I wanted to just record this video about comics really affected me, and when I think back about how I collected comics, and I think about John, and I think about him getting me into comics and learning about a different lifestyle as a kid, and learning acceptance and tolerance of people, and then reading comics with black superheroes, especially now with all the shit that's still going on in the United States in 2016, which is tragic. I just wanted to share that, like, I love comics, I love superhero movies, and in 2016 we have 7 superhero movies from comics coming to the big screen. That's awesome. So I just wanted to share this origin story on why I collect comics and love them. Cheers, subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Little personal video. Cheers. Go Rangers. And Batman v Superman will be awesome. And so will Civil War and X-Men Apocalypse and Suicide Squad and Doctor Strange. Cheers.